Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadar Rasulullah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadar Rasulullah. Hayya ala salah. Hayya ala salah. Hayya ala al-falah. Hayya ala al-falah. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. La ilaha illallah.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Today we are going to look at verses 11 to 13 of chapter 49 of the Holy Quran. I will only recite the Arabic of the first verse, but I'll recite the translation of all three of them. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا يسخر قوم من قوم عسى أن يكونوا خيرا منهم ولا نساء من نساء عسى أن يكن خيرا منهن ولا تلمزوا أنفسكم ولا تنابزوا بالألقاب بئس الاسم الفسوق بعد الإيمان ومن لم يتب فأولئك هم الظالمون. And the English translation of verses 11, 12 and 13 is, O you who believe, let not people laugh at others, in case they may be better than they are. Nor let women laugh at other women, in case they are better than they. Neither find fault with your own people, nor call one another by nicknames. Evil is a bad name after faith, and whoso turns not, these it is that are iniquitous. O you who believe, avoid most of suspicion, for surely suspicion in some cases is a sin. And spy not, nor let some of you backbite others. Does one of you like to eat the flesh of his dead brother? You abhor it, and keep your duty to Allah. Surely Allah is often returning to mercy and merciful. O mankind, surely we have created you from a single male and a female, and made you into tribes and families only so that you may recognize each other. Surely the noblest of you with Allah is the one who's most dutiful. Surely Allah is knowing and aware. And the Holy Prophet himself said during his last sermon, last Hajj sermon, he said, no Arab is superior to non-Arab. No colored person to a white person, nor a white person to a colored person, except in the observance of duty. I've chosen these verses of the Holy Quran because of what happened to Azim Rafiq and the treatment he received at Yorkshire Cricket Club. Now, I recited these verses, but since then, the captain of the Australian team has also had to resign because he'd been sending inappropriate messages to the ladies who work in their cricket office or whatever it is. And there are two words which are confused. One is prejudice and the other one is discrimination. Prejudice means that without finding out, without knowing, you just judge people. And we had this in 1960s and so on. The immigrants from India and Pakistan started arriving in the UK in late 50s. And people of this country had preconceived notions. They'd never met an Indian or a Pakistani or whatever, and yet, they had certain notions about them. I found it amusing that there was an interview of a trade union rep. The trade union was campaigning that Asians, Indians, and Pakistanis shouldn't be engaged as conductors on buses in various cities like London and Birmingham and Bradford and so on. And his argument was that the conductors have to work at a certain speed, and Indians and Pakistanis can't work at that speed. What amused me was that it was the same Indians and Pakistanis who'd been fighting for the British in the deserts of North Africa and in jungles of Burma and so on. So they had the appropriate speed to drive tanks and fired machine guns and fight the Japanese and the Germans and the Italians and so on, but not to cut tickets. Now that guy had no information on which he based this. And discrimination is actually putting your prejudice into practice. So based on your ill-judged, ill-informed opinion of someone, you then proceed to treat them less favorably than others. It may be one group, it may be an individual, and so on. And discrimination takes the form of verbal slurs, failure to provide reasonable accommodation or access, media portrayal, as we see about Muslims mostly, preferential pay, hiring or admissions policies, and hate crimes and And it can be done by individuals and groups or institutions, as we've seen that Azim has said that Yorkshire Cricket Club is institutionally racist by the way that he was treated. But I want to share some personal experiences with you because we came to the UK. The second time we came to the UK, I think it was 1962 or 63. And when we would go out looking for accommodation, there'd be notices in windows of bed and breakfast places and so on. No dogs, no Irish, no blacks. So you can see that Irish and colored people were being categorized with dogs. And it wasn't just a sort of, in a way, general statements that were made, but people were specifically discriminated against. My mother, who has a master's in economics, a master's in education, and a bachelor in teaching, and a bachelor in economics, and a certificate in teaching, a postmaster certificate in teaching from United States. She was picked as a scholar by the American government and given a scholarship to go and study in America. And she was invited for an interview. She had applied for a job and she walked in and sat down, and there was dead silence. And eventually the chairman of the board said, well, we apologize for troubling you, Mrs. Aziz. We looked at your qualifications when we couldn't even imagine that an Asian woman, a Muslim woman, could be so well qualified. We thought it must be an English lady married to a Muslim or a Pakistani. And this is the woman who was selected as a Fulbright scholar by the American government and given a scholarship. So he said, so we are not prepared to even interview you, let alone give you a job. And they paid her traveling expenses and sent her home. And to put on record, her first job, this Fulbright scholarship in UK, was a cleaner in a school. And what happened was that on her first day, she turned up and the school headmistress interviewed her and sort of commented, by the way, that the level of education in Pakistan must be much higher than in India, because girls who come from India can't speak English and you speak very good English. And my mother said, well, I was a headmistress and a Fulbright scholar. And the headmistress said, but this job is for cleaning. And she said, yes. Degrees and certificates don't put food on the table. So the headmistress sent her home and said, I can't possibly employ you. But she subsequently wrote to my mum and invited her back to go as a teacher. And that was how she got her first teaching job. My father, he was invited for an interview, and the headmaster sat down and said, Mr. Aziz, I only invited you for an interview because we didn't get any white applicants. Now, because we don't have a teacher, you can start work, but as soon as we'll keep advertising, and as soon as we find a white applicant, we'll dismiss you and that person will take your place. At which point my father told him what to do with his job. His first job was as a factory worker. And the interesting thing was that the personnel manager who interviewed him, he said, Mr. Aziz, I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed to interview you for a job as a machine minder because the whole of our board of directors doesn't have the number of qualifications that you have. But it was fortunate that by accident, the same day my father found that a Pakistani teacher had resigned because he was being treated as a teacher's help rather than a teacher and getting paid very little. And he managed to get that job. Now, the thing about this society is that, yes, all of this goes on. But when these things are brought to the notice of the people who run the country, they actually try and make changes. So in 60s, people like our parents and so, they didn't go out and kill policemen or blow up concerts or anything. They struggled hard to try and change the system. And eventually the parliament realized, and the first Race Relations Act was passed, which said you cannot discriminate against a person on the basis of their color and so on and so forth. But simply passing laws does not change society. It forces them to adopt more sophisticated means of discrimination. If you want to change the society, then you have to educate people. And sorry, something's gone wrong with our video. I apologize to people who were listening on the radio that we've lost video, and we're trying to get that back. So perhaps I should break into a song or something to keep the radio listeners entertained while we try and get the picture back. I see people are frantically pressing buttons and things. Someone seems to be trying the age-old technique when you lose sound or picture, that you go up to your television or whatever it is, and you hit it on the side hard with a hammer or something. So so to get back to what I was saying, that the parliament makes laws, but they don't basically change the society. Society is only changed by education and through interaction with other people. And one way Muslims can advance their cause is by interacting with their neighbors and their friends and their colleagues and so on and so forth. And showing that they are good human beings. Let me give you another personal example. And that is that my brother-in-law Salim, he's an English Muslim. I mean, if you want to be whiter than him, you'll have to buy a can of Dulux Brilliant White and paint your face white. You could not get whiter than he is. And yet, whenever he applied under his Muslim name, Salim Ahmed, he wouldn't even get an interview. So, a friend of ours, our mother's, she suggested an experiment. She said, send in 2 applications, one under the name Salim Ahmed giving my parents' address, and one under the name Paul Johnson, his original name, and give his actual address. Paul Johnson always got an invitation to an interview, and Salim Ahmed never did. Yeah, it's the same person. He had the same, both had the same qualifications, the same work experience, and so on. And that's the point I'm making. You change the laws and you make this an offense to do these things, but society finds other ways of discriminating against people. But one problem is that Muslims themselves display prejudice and racism and discrimination. They treat other people, like Hindus and Sikhs and so on, as somehow inferior to them. There was an incident when primary school children were to be taken to a Gurdwara and they were going to offer them Coke and crisps and so on. And all the Muslim kids were saying, well, we are forced to go to the Gurdwara because we live in this heathen country, but when you go there, don't touch anything to eat and drink. You will become a heretic. You will go out of the fold of Islam. If this is your attitude, if this is our attitude towards other people living in this country, then why do we expect better treatment? Why do we say that we should not be discriminated against? None of you will remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. Then that's when Cuba was, well, it's still a communist country, but Fidel Castro had taken over Cuba. And Americans' spy surveillance flights over Cuba showed that Russians were building missile silos. So a crisis, Americans didn't want Russian nuclear missiles 50 miles from their border. So they blockaded Cuba so that this work could stop, and if there were any missiles, they could be removed. And so the surveillance flights increased, and one flight showed how the Russian and Cuban Air Force had lined up their planes to fight an American Air Force attack. And the American Air Force officers, they were laughing, they were saying, look at these photographs, all the aeroplanes are lined up in a line, and if we get one jet fighter through and it fires a machine gun, that will destroy all their planes. If we miss any, as a plane explodes, it will destroy the next three lined up next to it. And there was great merriment at the stupidity of the Russians and the Americans until someone suggested, why don't we send up a plane to see how American planes are lined up? And they did. And Americans' planes were lined up on the runway in exactly the same way as the Russian and the Cuban ones. The point is this: it's easy to pick on other people and their faults and their shortcomings and so on. But sometimes we should try and look in the mirror to see that we don't suffer from the same things. We are rightly proud that we say Hazrat Bilal Raziyallahu Ta'ala, who was a slave, who was a black slave, and in that society that would put you in the lowest category. You could not get any lower than being a slave and a black person at the same time, 1500 years ago in Saudi Arabia. But When the time came to select the first person to call the azan at the Holy Prophet's mosque, the Holy Prophet chose him. He was the master of the Holy Prophet's household. He looked all the income and expenses and which wife needed, what clothes and what food was needed and all that kind of thing. He was also the Minister of Finance, like the Chancellor of the Exchequer. But do we get that example today? In many countries, if you don't belong to the majority Muslim sect, people would object to you getting a high profile job. We have this in Pakistan. And some minority sects or some sects which are disliked, someone from them, it doesn't matter how able they are given a high profile job, a responsible job, and suddenly there are riots in the streets. Our own Amir, Dr. Abdul Karim Saeed, he's a doctor. He worked in New Zealand, he worked in the UK. Here, I think he was a consultant. But then he left because he wanted to serve Pakistan. And after many years, the government there decided to appoint him as the principal of the medical college where he worked. And there were riots in the streets. How can you make a Lahori MD the principal? He's going to teach them Ahmadiyya. If you want to take someone's appendix out, what's being an Ahmadi or a Jew or a Hindu or anything else got to do with it? All the Pakistani top politicians and military brass and everyone, they come to the UK for medical treatment. Do they say that Cornwall Hospital must employ Muslims to dispense medicine to them, to cook their food, to examine them, to do their, to conduct their operations? Well, Cornwall Hospital would just tell them to go away and say, we've got our staff and we'll do our best, but you don't dictate to us who we employ. What has that to do with the skills that are required? Isn't this an example of prejudice and discrimination? Of course it is. But we cannot change the attitude of the local community simply by relying on laws that the parliament passes. We need to show by our own conduct that we are better people, that we don't discriminate, we exercise no prejudice. And unfortunately, that is not true. Yes, I agree that Yorkshire Cricket Club should be investigated and punished for treating Azim Rafiq in the way that they did. I agree that it was right to sack the captain of the Australian cricket team for the inappropriate messages that he sent to the females who worked in that office. But let us go back and end with the verse 11 of chapter 49. O you who believe, let not people laugh at others. They might be better than you. Let not women laugh at other women in case they're better than them. Neither find fault with your own people, nor call one another by nicknames. Evil is a bad name after faith, and whoso turns not, these it is that are iniquitous. And I leave you with this question. Do you think this description given in this verse of the Holy Quran applies to us or not? बारकल्लाहु लना व लकुम फिल कुरानिल अज़ीम व नफ़अना व इय्याकुम बिल आयाति व ज़िक्रिल हकीम इन्नहु तआला जवादुन करीमुन मलिकुन व रऊफुर रहीम। अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह अल्हम्दुलिल्लाहि नहमदुहु व नस्तईनुहु व नस्तगफिरुहु व नुमिनु बिही व नतवक्कलु अलैहि व नऊज़ु बिल्लाहि मिन शुरूरि अनफुसिना व मिन सय्यिआति अमालिना मन यहदिहिल्लाहु फला मुदिल्ल लहु व मन युद्लिल फला हादिय लहु व अशहदु अल्ला इलाहा इल्लल्लाह व अशहदु अन्ना मुहम्मदन अब्दुहु व रसूलुहु। अल्लाहुम्मा सल्लि अला मुहम्मदिन व अला आलि मुहम्मदिन कमा सल्लैता अला इब्राहीम व अला आलि इब्राहीम इन्नका हमीदुम मजीद। अल्लाहुम्मा बारिक अला मुहम्मदिन व अला आलि मुहम्मदिन कमा बारकता अला इब्राहीम व अला आलि इब्राहीम इन्नका हमीदुम मजीद। अल्लाहुम्मा अंसुर मन नसर दीन मुहम्मदिन सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम वजअलना मिनहुम वख्ज़ुल मन ख़ज़ल दीन मुहम्मदिन सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि वसल्लम वला तजअलना मिनहुम। इबादल्लाह रहमकुमुल्लाह इन्नल्लाह यामुरु बिल अदलि वल इहसानि व इताइ ज़िल कुर्बा व यन्हा अनिल फ़हशाइ वल मुनकरि वल बग़yi यइज़ुकुम लअल्लकुम तज़क्करून। इज़्कुरुल्लाह यज़्कुरुकुम वद्कुरूहु यस्तजिब लकुम व लज़िक्रुल्लाहि अकबर वल्लाहु यअलमु मा तस्नऊन।
अल्लाहु अकबर, अल्लाहु अकबर। अशहदु अल्ला इलाहा इल्लल्लाह, अशहदु अन्ना मुहम्मदन रसूलुल्लाह। हय्य अलस सलाह, हय्य अलल फलाह, क़द क़ामतिस सलाह, क़द क़ामतिस सलाह। अल्लाहु अकबर, अल्लाहु अकबर, ला इलाहा इल्लल्लाह।
अल्लाहु अकबर। अल्हम्दुलिल्लाहि रब्बिल आलमीन अर्रहमानिर रहीम मालिकि यौमिद्दीन इय्याका नअबुदु व इय्याका नस्तईन इहदिनस सिरातल मुस्तकीम सिरातल लज़ीना अनअमता अलैहिम गैरिल मग़दूबि अलैहिम वलद्दाल्लीन आमीन। वल अस्र इन्नल इंसाना लफ़ी खुस्र इल्लल्लज़ीना आमनु व अमिलुस सालिहाति व तवाफ़ौ बिल हक़्क़ि व तवाफ़ौ बिस सब्र। अल्लाहु अकबर। समी अल्लाहु लिमन हमिदा।
रब्बना लकल हम्द।
अल्लाहु अकबर। अल्लाहु अकबर। अल्लाहु अकबर। अल्लाहु अकबर। इन्ना अअतैनाकल कौसर। अल्हम्दुलिल्लाहि रब्बिल आलमीन अर्रहमानिर रहीम मालिकि यौमिद्दीन إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. إنا أعطيناك الكوثر فصل لربك وانهر إن شانئك هو الأبتر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده.
ربنا لك الحمد.
الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. أستغفر الله. لا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة اللهم تبارك. Thank you for joining us for our Friday service. My apologies for the error that I made. I'm sure Allah is forgiving and merciful, even if human beings are not. And the third sajda in the second rakah, it's called the prostration to ask for forgiveness for making an error. Sajda Sahib. So that was why there was an extra sajda. With a prayer that whoever you are, wherever you may be, may Allah keep all of you safe and sound and free from harm. Assalamu alaikum, Khuda Hafiz, and goodbye.